for attending today's business continuity webinar. My name's Jack Collins. I'm Chief of Staff at JR1 Partners, and I'll be helping to support today's webinar. The aim of today's webinar is to provide you with insights about ways to enhance your business continuity arrangements. Today, we will have two speakers that will discuss this topic, colleagues of mine. It's my pleasure to introduce Mark Scott, who is the director with the group and head of the risk management practice. We're also joined by Grace Basmadjian, who's a risk manager based out of the DIFC office. We'll have an hour for today's session, and before we dive into the presentation, I would like to invite everyone to please leave your questions in the chat. At the end of today's presentation, we'll have a question and answer session using questions from the chat. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and I'll now hand over to Mark and Grace. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jack, and thank you for the very warm introduction, and welcome again to everyone who's connected into today's session. The reason why we put together today's session is really been as an introduction, has been a response, I think, to some of our observations of many of the things that we've seen by working with our existing client base. I'm speaking to you today. I'm based in Abu Dhabi, work with a wide variety of clients across the UAE and in Saudi and the MENA region as well. And many of the observations I think that we've seen are experiences that we've learned by working with the clients that we have already. And also from, I think, for where we've networked within a number of different industries and experiences that other fellow practitioners have also shared through their own experiences as well. So what we'll be talking to you about today is less about specifics about regulations or things that tie to any one particular industry, but more about practical steps that people can take to improve their business continuity and make that effective. Because without that practical element to what people do, then of course, business continuity will never be effective. Because whilst, yes, I sit here in Abu Dhabi, I look out the window and see the sun shining, business continuity is about, of course, the rainier days, the days when things are cloudier, those one-off events that can result in a crisis, or that term we use, the business continuity event. So the areas that we're going to be covering today, Grace, my colleague Grace Basmadjian, I'll be introducing her further into the session. Grace will be leading a section of today's webinar on business impact analysis, and I will be also talking about business continuity testing. We've chosen those two specific elements. I mean, there's many elements I'm sure that we could talk about when we think about business continuity, but these are two specific areas that quite often I think people are still in this region getting to grips with and still haven't always perfected the art of. And again, we wanted to share our experience in those areas. If we wanted just to talk a second about some of the key challenges of, I've mentioned observations about the clients and companies that we've worked with. What are these common mistakes or trends that we've typically tended to see? I think there's been a real focus sometimes, perhaps too much focus on policies and documentation. Of course, within the region, there's a huge wealth of activity. We see many startups and a lot of growth coming from companies. When companies are obviously at startup stage, particularly for firms who work in a regulated environment, the focus is on setting up the business, obtaining their license, having the right policies and documentations, perhaps even meeting the minimum standard regulatory-wise of what they need to do. But of course, topics like business continuity, as we've said already, go well beyond that. And then it's more about the implementation. And sometimes I think firms haven't always thought through that implementation bit, either because they have capacity challenges or their own skills challenges in understanding what is the best way of doing that. So the net result is that there is sometimes then too much of a focus on regulatory compliance and maybe ticking that regulatory box. And as a result, not enough to test the plans. Think if there was really a crisis in our business, how would it actually work? Does our plan really do things that will allow us to survive that event and get through it and prove that we have a resilient organization? The last point is probably just around business continuity, if you look at it holistically, is a really broad topic. It covers lots of different specialisms. Yes, there's the classic areas of fires and floods and areas such as issues to do with the building, etc. But in today's technology-enabled world, it obviously covers much broader IT technology availability, infrastructure issues, cyber attacks, and as well, of course, as we've learned in the last few years, people-related events around pandemics and key persons and many of the other different types of risks that we have to manage in our businesses. All of those things bring in a variety of different specialists in our business. And sometimes the business continuity plan, I think, is perhaps too narrow in focus. It needs to align to other response plans and other documents or approaches that are perhaps in place. So our call is perhaps, how can we do that better? And recent events, of course, tell us that, you know, the wide world around us tells us all these things are ever more present and important than ever. Anybody who lives in Dubai will know now that it does rain, and we've experienced floods this year. It's not an impossible event that can't happen, and it can cause real challenges when it does. You know, the political environment around us, you know, conflicts in different parts of the world are very real, and whilst they may not necessarily impact on our businesses directly always in security terms, they can impact us in other ways in terms of our people, our colleagues, our partners we work with, the markets in which we operate, etc. All of these things can create a stressed environment in which our companies operate, and that can create in itself a crisis or business continuity event. We've mentioned technology already, and of course regulatory expectation. I think really what we've seen quite a bit is that, you know, many of the clients we work with, I wouldn't say necessarily regulations around business continuity are changing. Of course, in areas like Europe, with the Operational Resilience Act, DORA, that's in the process of being implemented at the moment, there's a lot of activity, many will know, that's happening over there. But what is happening in, I think, in the MENA region is that there is a changing expectation from regulators around business continuity. Things like business impact analysis that we're going to talk about is being asked for. I know, for example, now in the ADGM more regularly, we hear central bank talking to firms much more proactively about areas like material outsourcing, which also ties into resilience and business continuity as well. So these things are important and are definitely on the regulator's radar. So we're not going to cover we're just going to give, you know, perhaps a quick recap of some of the business continuity basics, and some of these I've already begun to talk about. But in the point I made earlier about business continuity is a broad area. If we look at it through the lens of all the different types of scenarios that could potentially impact on an organization, we can see here on this illustration on the left, it covers a number of different things. You know, and of course, also, not all of these things will impact on every firm in the same way. If you're a financial services firm, you'll have a very different risk profile than if you're involved in industry or manufacturing, or you're providing a service of some kind. The key, obviously, is about understanding what does your risk profile look like, and what are the types of risks that are inherent based upon your business model and your strategy. Thinking about those things helps you think about what are the most appropriate business continuity arrangements to have in place. And by doing that in a traditional risk management sense, it allows you to mitigate those risks, ensure the financial stability of your business, and protect the reputation of your organization as well. And these, some, as an example, these are obviously some of the many components that perhaps sit across business continuity, and there'll be different terms that sometimes people use when they talk about these things, and we won't dive into all of these in detail. But as we said, we're going to talk about BIA and testing specifically in detail as part of the session. So there's an introduction from me. I will come back later. I'm going to talk about testing, but now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Grace. So Grace is one of our subject matter experts who works in our firm at JO1. Grace is regularly out in the field working with a wide variety of different clients and has led a number of exercises to deliver and implement business impact analysis exercises in different firms. And this talk now is going to walk through many of the kind of pitfalls and challenges and kind of best practice areas that companies can really think about to make this type of exercise work if they're to implement that for themselves. So I'll hand over to you, Grace. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mark, for the intro, and thank you all for joining today. So, Mark, as you mentioned, the BIA is one of the most important components of business continuity because it helps in identifying the critical processes that must be prioritized during a disruption, and it ensures that you have the appropriate recovery strategies to minimize your downtime and to resume your business operations normally. So before I share some insights into the challenges we face when conducting BIAs for clients, I'd like to take a moment to briefly refresh everyone on the BIA process, especially for those who may be new to the concept today. So when developing your BIA, the first step is to be able to identify your critical business processes, which will vary depending on your understanding of these processes. So if you are a mature business, you will likely have some well-documented policies and procedures, process maps, and work instructions that might focus on processes and controls. If you are a young business, you may only have a few documents that satisfy regulatory requirements, and these might outline what is only expected from you from a regulatory perspective. But the BIA is asking you here to determine which processes are critical and what needs to be recovered operationally in the event of a business continuity disruption. Now, this can be a challenge because it might require you to consider aspects of your business you might never have thought of before, and it might need you to bring together your management team and staff to reflect on what the business actually does. So you need to think about your product and services that you are offering. If, for example, you are a manufacturing company, you would be relying on some materials and your suppliers to achieve your outcomes. So supply chain and procurement processes would come into play. If you are a financial services business, your critical processes will differ because whether you are lending or you're offering investment services or managing funds, each will have like unique operational considerations. Additionally, you would also have some back-end processes like finance and HR, and these will provide you with the infrastructure and support to your critical functions. As part of this process, you should also consider how you want to document your processes. They might be at a department level, at a company-wide level, or even at an outsourcing level, because third-party vendors, they often play a critical role in supporting your business. So when you're identifying your critical processes, it's also important to include these third parties and the dependency on these third parties, because we tend to often depend on them. Because like their failure, it would directly impact your operations as well. Now, after identifying these critical business processes, it's important to assess how much impact a disruption would have if those processes were unavailable or couldn't be carried out. Let's say you're about to submit your financial statements to the regulator as part of the finance critical processes, which are due, let's say, on the 31st of March. So if a disaster happened and you're not able to perform this critical task and you're unable to submit them, these financial services, let's say for 1 hour, what would that impact be? For 2 hours, let's say it lasted, the disruption lasted for 6 hours. How would you act accordingly? What would the impact be? So this is normally quantified through an impact matrix that classifies the impact and ranks it based on the criticality of the impact from minimal to severe. Now, once you have quantified the impact of your disruption on your critical processes, you need to assess the potential downtime and data loss. So for each critical process, so here we're referring to the terminologies recovery time objective, RTO, and recovery point objective, RPO. And just to give a brief recap on these metrics here on the next slide, thanks. So what is meant by RTO? The RTO is the maximum time that you can tolerate without performing this critical process. So how long can you go without submitting your financials to the regulator? Another critical process would be in the HR, for example, space, the payroll. If something happens to your payroll system, how long can you go without paying your employees? So it's the maximum acceptable amount of time that a process or system can be offline after a disruption and before it significantly impacts your business. The RPO, on the other hand, it's about your data loss, and how much level of data loss in hours you're willing to accept when you recover your processes. So how much recent data you can afford to lose without causing major problems. Let's just illustrate with an example here. I always give the example of the payroll because it's easy to understand and people can relate to it. So let's say your payroll system goes down. So your RTO is the maximum time you can afford to be without it before employees start facing issues with their pay. So if your RTO for payroll is set to be 4 hours, it means you need to have the system back online within 4 hours to ensure that there are no disruptions in paying your employees on time. If you have set an RPO for payroll of 1 hour, it means you can only afford to lose up to 1 hour's worth of payroll data. So any loss beyond that, it could cause issues with accurately paying your employees. So let's say, as we can see here on the illustration, so the payroll system, let's say it crashes at 10 a.m. So your RTO is set to be 4 hours, so the system should be back online by 2 p.m. within 4 hours. Now, when the system is restored at 2 p.m., and let's say your last backup was at 12 p.m., because you have set an RPO of 1 hour, so you are saying that you can lose only up to 1 hour of data, which is from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. If you lose more than that, then you need to revisit your BIA because you have gaps that need to be addressed. Now, back to the BIA process. So once you have identified your RTO and RPOs for each critical process, you will need to identify your human resources, your technology resources, and your facilities for each of the critical functions. And you would need to assess the availability and the capacity of these resources. So you will need to ensure that you have the right personnel in place who can effectively execute these functions. And then you would need to evaluate the technology required from a software perspective, hardware perspective, your communication systems, to determine their availability and reliability. Finally, with all your information that you have gathered, it's time to develop and implement your risk mitigating strategies to safeguard your firm. And this may include establishing some backup systems to ensure data and operational continuity. You might need to have some contingency plans that outline specific actions that you need to take in various scenarios. Now, as we go through the BIA journey, there are several processes involved in conducting a successful BIA. However, many of our clients do face some challenges along the way. So let's discuss a bit these challenges and what are the actions that firms need to implement to make the BIA more effective. A key step to start the BIA exercise is promoting staff awareness. And one of the challenges that we've seen is that when training employees on the BIA topic, people tend to show some lack of engagement in some instances because they would probably they're not much familiar with the process and they cannot directly see the relevance of this exercise. Another aspect would be the complexity of information that they need to deal with due to the technical nature of the BIA, and they would sometimes face some lack of support from management. So for firms to overcome these challenges, it is important to communicate the importance of the BIA to employees by providing some awareness sessions and by focusing on the impact that disruptions could have if there's no BIA in place, and also ensure that senior management supports the BIA exercise to ensure that it has sufficient authority and visibility. Now, once staff have been given awareness sessions, relevant stakeholders will need to fill the defined BIA templates and they need to follow the guidelines. And we have seen that some clients have also faced some difficulties in filling these templates, maybe because like just the technicalities of the RPOs and RTOs, which also would need ongoing support along the process. Once these templates are filled, results will need to be collated and feedback will be provided. And one of the main challenges we've observed here during this process is the inconsistency in the responses from different departments when filling these BIA templates. So often every department may see itself as very critical to the business, even though some processes may actually be more of a support function. So they might set some short and tight RPOs and RTOs, which are often not realistic. And additionally, departments sometimes provide incomplete and missing information, which can also impact the effectiveness of the analysis. So this is when it is important for you to take a step back and reassess this BIA process to identify what might be missing. So this involves looking at the overall analysis and asking key questions like, are all critical processes covered? Is any important information lacking? So this step ensures that the BIA is comprehensive, and it would allow you as a firm to address any overlooked areas or gaps in data before moving forward. Once consistencies in these responses are identified, then it is necessary to provide clear and constructive feedback. So because some departments, just like others, may underestimate their RTOs, others might overestimate their importance or provide incomplete data. So by offering feedback, you can guide them in refining their inputs. Another important point would be to incorporate IT and other technical teams to review these BIA results. These teams have normally deep knowledge of system dependencies and technical infrastructure and support processes, and they can help validate the accuracy of the information provided by other departments. So, and it is also very important to mention that the BIA is not just an exercise owned by risk management teams. It is mainly owned by the people in the departments who own these processes. They are the experts in their areas, and this exercise sits with them, which is like the first line of defense. Now, after collating the results and getting the necessary feedback, it's time to identify gaps and provide recommendations. In some instances, we tend to see a reluctance from firms' management to invest in the necessary improvements that are identified in the BIA. It might be due to budgetary constraints, or maybe because they don't see the immediate threats to the business. The key here is to explain that these aren't just nice to have improvements. They're very necessary steps to protect your business. And should always remember that investing now can save the company from bigger problems down the road, like some operational shutdowns or any penalties that you might have to be paying later on. Another common issue is the lack of resources to execute the changes identified by the BIA. So whether it's insufficient budget or a shortage of skilled staff or some competing priorities, firms may struggle to implement the necessary updates. So this can leave critical risks unaddressed for an extended period of time, which increases the firm's vulnerability. Another point is getting internal buy-in, especially from leadership, which can be a major obstacle sometimes. Without leadership's full support, it becomes very difficult to prioritize and implement the recommendations that come out of the BIA. So if leadership or other key stakeholders do not see the value in the BIA findings, the firm risks continuing with these unmitigated vulnerabilities and potentially leading to larger issues down the line. So to make sure the BIA results lead to real change, it's important to engage with key stakeholders, especially leadership, early on, and because they will need to understand the importance of the findings and to be fully on board with the actions. When it comes to implementing the BIA recommendations, it's also important to focus on both the short-term fixes and the long-term goals. So it's about identifying quick wins as well as longer-term strategic priorities. Quick wins help demonstrate progress, while the bigger strategic priorities can be planned and tackled over time to ensure sustained improvement. Every action that comes out of the BIA needs to make sense for the business as a whole. So it's important that the recommended steps not only address risks, but also support the company's broader goals and objectives. And this ensures that your business continuity planning is directly contributing to the long-term success of the organization. Finally, it is time to report these results to senior management and take action. A frequent issue during the BIA process is the complexity of reporting of the findings. So some departments, they might often provide detailed and technical information to senior management that can be difficult to translate into actionable insights. So this creates a challenge in effectively communicating the importance of the findings and securing the necessary support for implementation. Another problem that often arises is the lack of clear ownership for implementing the BIA recommendations. So when responsibility isn't clearly assigned to specific individuals or teams, actions can also fail to be noticed. Sometimes the timelines for making control improvements can also be overly ambitious, especially given the available resources that the firm has. So when expectations for completion are unrealistic, this can lead to rushed or incomplete implementation, and this could ultimately reduce the effectiveness of the measures, and it would leave gaps in the company's risk management framework. And this is why it's important to break down complex data into concise, actionable insights that are easy for management and other teams to understand, and ensure that all actions have accountable owners and completion dates. Now, if we take a moment to take a step back and examine what the BIA is telling us, we'll see that it generates a lot of information. And again, the aim here is to simplify the information and break it down into easy to understand parts that can simply be understood and communicated to senior management. So an easy approach to follow that we adopt here at Awan is to break the BIA results into three broad categories: protect the business, run the business, and grow the business. Protecting the business is about understanding the most critical and urgent triggers and issues that need to be actioned within the first critical hours of a disruption. And this is ideally within the first 24 hours after the occurrence of an event. The second step is about running the business, and this is about prioritizing your processes based on the assigned objectives, recovery objectives, the RTOs and RPOs that you had set before to sustain business operations within a time frame that could be between 72 hours up to 1 week following the crisis. And finally, growing the business is about fostering your business growth while maintaining dependency on critical processes to minimize similar impacts in the future. So when you're diversifying your operations, when you're exploring alternative processes and investing in technology, organizations can create a more resilient structure that lessens reliance on any single function. Next slide. Okay. Now, when it comes to understanding the gaps, the BIA should reveal insights about your organization that were previously unknown. So if the analysis fails to uncover any new information, your assessment is probably has been inadequate or incomplete. And this is why, as a firm, you need to have a thorough examination of your processes, dependencies, and vulnerabilities. Equally, it is important to understand what departments have requested and suggested in terms of RTOs and RPOs, and then assess whether these objectives can realistically be achieved with the current resources and strategies in place. If the analysis reveals that these objectives cannot be met, then this allows your firm to identify gaps and make informed decisions about resource allocation, potential investments, and adjustments to your business continuity plans. An additional important area to consider is communication. So crisis communication is very important during an emergency because it helps keep all stakeholders informed, and it also helps maintain their trust. So you need to have a clear plan for communicating with your stakeholders, which are your customers, your investors, shareholders, regulators, and any external party. This way, you can provide timely updates and reassure everyone about your response efforts. Updating the company's website is also a key part of this communication strategy because it allows you to share real-time information about any incident, keeping both your internal staff and external stakeholders in the loop. Additionally, proactively engaging with the media is important because you need to manage your story and you need to control the spread of misinformation, which can sometimes be harmful to your reputation. Now, finally, to the last section, what are the key factors that need to be taken into consideration to report the results? And just to sum up, it is very important to ensure that your BIA is closely aligned to your BCP. And this is about identifying any gaps where the continuity plans may not have adequately addressed the requirements highlighted in the BIA. By doing so, you can pinpoint areas that need improvement and make the necessary adjustments to ensure that your plans are effective in mitigating these disruptions. You need to also take a moment to step back and evaluate your BIA process as a whole. And this means assessing whether the analysis is detailed and comprehensive and it covers all the necessary aspects of the business. You need to ask yourself if all the critical areas have been covered, if the plan has been comprehensive, is there any lack of clarity or any areas underdeveloped? Now, once you get your insights from the BIA and BCP, you gather them, you need to consider how will this information be communicated to senior management or the board. Effective messaging involves conveying a clear and concise report that highlights your key findings. So you need to focus on, let's say, your top 3 priorities, give your top 3 recommendations, and then the potential impact on the organization. This would help them make informed decisions, and it would make them understand the significance of the insight, and they can take the appropriate actions. Knowing your audience is also very important. And here we're not just talking about the board, but some other committees or any other teams that might be involved in this process. So it's important to tailor the content to your specific audience, to understand their needs, their interests, and level the level of the familiarity with the subject matter, and to provide sufficient information for them to make decisions, and to also focus on the urgency and importance of the findings, which would enable them to make informed decisions. Setting clear recommendations is also very important. So these recommendations should be specific, measurable, and realistic to ensure that they can be effectively executed. And you need to have clear actions because this would help in tracking progress and drive improvement. Finally, establishing accountability is key to ensuring that recommendations are acted upon. So when you define the responsible parties for each action and set clear timelines for completion, you can create a sense of ownership and ensure that necessary tasks are completed in a timely manner, ultimately improving your resilience against these disruptions. So we have taken you over some of the key aspects when developing your BIAs. Now back to you, Mark, to walk us through the key areas to consider in testing the business continuity plan.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Grace. That's been incredibly useful. I know I've been making some notes there. I hope others have been too. I mean, I think for me, the real message that comes through all of that is BIA is not just a process. It's not just something that the risk department or any one individual, if it's either to do it in a holistic way, like the way that you've been talking about. It involves a broad section of stakeholders. And I think most importantly, it's about obtaining buy-in, I think, from all areas of the organization, buy-in and understanding. So right at the board level, because for the people who are accountable in the business, they need to understand the outputs and understand the progress, the work and the risks that are coming out of the exercise. But it's also about people at the lower level, the operational level too, unless they understand the exercise and how it works. And some of these kind of terms that get used, these RTOs and RPOs, they're not always easy for people to get to grips with. And we've experienced, I know that ourselves with our own clients. And I think bringing these things to life is all an important part of this whole exercise, because with poor inputs comes poor outputs, I think. So it needs to all work together. But thank you again. That's been fantastic. So let's move on to testing then. And this was one of the other focus areas, I think, that we wanted to shine a light on as part of today's session. So I think it's obvious, isn't it? I think when we talk business continuity, clearly a big part of it is about preparing for what might happen. Perhaps it's a little like an insurance policy. Hopefully it's something we never have to cash in. Maybe we'll never need it. But I think most of us, many of us, I know I'm certainly old enough to have lived through, unfortunately, a few crises and business continuity events myself when I've worked in industry previously. So the reliance and the benefit that comes from testing, I think, is paramount, and the need to get that right, both to kind of ensure that the way the plans are designed, they do actually work, but also just thinking along the lines of all of this work consumes an incredible amount of time and effort and resources from companies. So if we're going to spend time doing anything, we need to make sure we get the return on that, and things need to work. So testing really is about providing assurance, and however that gets done. I know people, when used the term insurance, will argue is that first, second, or third line. For the purpose of this, it doesn't matter. Testing is about just knowing the plans work and then communicating the outputs of that to senior management and to the board too. And maybe a little point I would make, and it relates to the kind of BIA thing we just talked about there before. But if I was maybe listening to today's session and I was a member of a board or I was a business owner, I would perhaps think about, what level of visibility do I have into how any of these things are being managed in my business? Am I relying on someone to do these things for me? And do I get the kind of reporting and insights I need to tell me that these areas across my business continuity management are being well managed and controlled? And if not, maybe it's time to ask that question about what else do I need to see? How do I personally get those assurances that in business continuity is being well managed? So focusing on testing then a little more. So I mean, common pitfalls of testing, and well, I mean, I know we've definitely seen some of this here at JO1, but when we've had several clients who've tried to say, let's, our business continuity test, we'll just ask everybody to work at home tomorrow. And that it feels like that's going to be their test. I mean, that's just testing what everybody knows already. In a lot of cases, if you're an office-based business, if you've lived through the pandemic, the chances are you're probably already doing that already, or at least some of the days of the week. A test, it should be a test. It should challenge our thinking and how we do things. And if it's not doing that, then it's not teaching us anything. And testing needs to be dynamic. I think it needs to probably evolve. What feels an appropriate test this year or this month, maybe, might not be less relevant next year. And we should try and learn from each test and build on that. We don't want to design things so we deliberately fail, but we want to learn, and it needs to evolve because real crises or real business continuity events can be quite unique and incredibly specific, and it's really hard to kind of guess what could happen. So the best we can do is at least try and test ourselves sufficiently to cover off different bases that we may not have thought about already. The other one is, I suppose, just conducting tests that are quite limited in scope, just focusing on areas, again, that maybe we know kind of, we're more in our comfort zone, we know they're more likely to work, even though we've never tested them. And again, it's not really kind of testing anything or prove anything that we don't already know. So the key is obviously to set clear test objectives. If we have a discussion in advance to say what do we need to know, what are the areas that we know work already, perhaps have been tested before, but what are the unknowns? What are the risks that we're concerned about? And equally, of course, what resources do we have available at our disposal? I realize, every company is different. As we said already, the risk profile of every organization is different. There's not unlimited resources to do any of this, but being clear on what can be done, and as I say, just try and evolving that thinking, or at least that approach each year, is more likely to result in a better set of outcomes for the business. So we've got a slide here covering some of the different types of testing, that we would typically see in organizations. And again, it's all dependent upon the size, scale, and complexity of a business, maybe even the maturity or the age of the business too. But if we kind of run from left to right here, these tests perhaps kind of go slightly upwards in terms of maybe the level of the time and effort and complexity that they might involve or take from the business. But equally, there's a certain, that as you move from left to right, you get an increased level of benefit, probably in most cases as well. You're probably likely to learn more, and it's because it's going to require more thinking or planning in order to deliver that type of test. So desktop reviews, let's begin with that. So this is probably the easiest type of review that can be conducted. This is something, the first two tests we're going to talk about, desktop reviews and scenario exercises, are kind of what I'd call workshop or classroom-based exercises. Desktop reviews is really a team of people, perhaps some of the senior management team, perhaps doing a page turn of the business continuity plan. And if you're a business that's defined your scenarios as part of your BCP, starting at high level to walk through some of those scenarios and consider how relevant do they feel. So if those scenarios are focused on physical threats to the building, whether they be fires or floods, the traditional business continuity events, whether they be scenarios more focused around your perhaps loss of technology, a cyber attack, perhaps even loss of people, those kind of spectrum of events, the things that we were talking about earlier, you would talk through those scenarios and think about, well, what are the kind of perhaps actions we'd be taking in response to each of them? Who would be involved? What would be some of the key decisions we need to take? How much have we thought that through? How much of that decision making have we necessarily documented? What information or would we need from the business? How much of that's readily available? What might not be available, depending on what's happened, because, if you're in a crisis, not everything is available. Sometimes decisions have to be made at speed and with limited insight, around the table. So thinking about some of that in advance is good. And then thinking about, well, what limitations do we have within our current plan in terms of whether or not we're able to think about any of those things. Because then you can start to think, well, can we actually tailor the plan a little more to some of these scenarios and make it feel more relevant, make it feel more useful? And that's when you start to get some of the real value from the BCP. So as it says here, it's kind of testing the plan for its kind of the completeness and quality of its contents. The next test that we've got here is the scenario exercise. So, slightly upping the game a bit, the level of effort required here. This is probably going to be more along the lines of a half-day workshop that probably be conducted through some kind of role play exercise, where this exercise needs a bit of prior planning to get this right, where again, thinking about scenarios, probably agreeing a predefined scenario that could reasonably or potentially impact the business in some way. So again, is that a building issue? Is that a loss of the systems in your business? If you've got an on-site server, what happens if that fails? If you use a cloud service provider, what happens if that fails? Or perhaps your internet service provider, what happens if they fail and they're down for a day? Just walking through a possible timeline of how you would manage that. And the way to get these role play exercises always right is that you'll always have some board members or senior members who are really bought into this, and others sometimes will struggle with the idea of playing this kind of role play or game, maybe some people might call it. And the way to get people's buy-in is through the prior planning, where it's working perhaps with some of the people who might not be involved in the test exercise to come up with this timeline of how the scenario might evolve over a period of a few hours or days during the exercise to help people think about, well, what could realistically happen. And I've even done exercises where I've brought in kind of like perhaps mock reports or MI that look similar to other things that get produced in the business, but just to act as almost props as part of the exercise to help inform people's thinking or some of the decisions maybe that they would take during the session. And all of that, typically gets buy-in and helps people with kind of suspending the disbelief into kind of the exercise and what's being trying to achieve. So these exercises, there's no right or wrong, but it's about just trying to get people to kind of work things through. And all of the findings and any discussion points are things that can't obviously be answered during the session, could be logged as actions, and of course gets written into kind of a management report, an action plan at the end, which can all easily be captured. And again, it allows people to learn and develop and move on from where things have been previously. The third test we've got here is simulation tests. So now we're starting to get to a stage where different type of test. This is probably more where we're involving a broader set of stakeholders. So whereas perhaps previously we're probably more focused on people at senior management level, now we're more likely to be involving people, a range of levels, perhaps both senior and more operational levels too, where we're going to conduct some kind of physical reenactment of the BCP. So typically these kind of tests get conducted by what are often larger firms. It could be a firm who have a work area recovery site, a war site, or at least a site or alternative location that has been earmarked to go and work should there be some kind of crisis event in the business. And the purpose of doing the simulation test normally is that, again, by doing, agreeing the test objectives, it can be agreed, sometimes even by using some of the information from the BIA to think about the critical processes, as Grace talked about, that are captured through that exercise, to then bring those things forward. And then as part of the process of going to the work area recovery site, looking to be able to have operational staff re-perform those critical processes at those locations. And obviously to do that, this needs to be done in parallel by working with some of the IT technical teams, because they need to be able to go to that site, bring services back online, recover them in whatever way that they have documented as part of their own recovery plans. And all of that can be done in parallel. But by I think the learning I've always found from these simulation tests is simply the process of people being sort of up, interacting physically in the office, and sometimes having to go off-site and work in different environments. All that in itself is a real learned experience, and does cover off an enormous amount of things that sometimes you would struggle to even experience just by sitting in a meeting room during a workshop. So these can be very valuable tests. The last kind of test that we've talked about here is the ITDR test. So I'm sure many people who've connected in today will have heard of this before, but this is the test that, particularly for the people in the IT and the information security areas, the cyber areas of the business, they will be trying to simulate an event where there has been what would be a sort of predefined disaster, which is a complete loss of systems. And they will go through the process of recovering those systems along with the firm's data to bring that back online, and doing that in a simulated way. And the test obviously is whether the recovery plans, in terms of how they've been documented, allow for the recovery of the systems and data within the business, but more importantly, doing that within a time frame that meets the recovery time objectives of the firm. So that becomes the test then, because obviously if it takes a week to recover everything, and then maybe the business was expecting it to be done in 12 hours or a day, clearly, that's a risk to the business. So these exercises are also, very important. So that's a run through of 4 different common types of tests. But I think hopefully everyone can see there's a real value in looking at any of them. And as I said, there's no necessarily, one size fits all, or if you do this one, that will result in perfection. Probably best practice is probably doing all of them at some point. But again, it's down to time and resources of any business being able to do that. So, okay, so we reached the key takeaways slide. I think so. We've got some really simple messages here, and hopefully people have been able to take notes and hear many of the things of what we've said already. But I think number one, I think, is in order to be able to understand if your BCP is well designed, we need to conduct a BIA. I think in an ideal state, we'd probably really complete a BIA first rather than a BCP, because the BIA, as we've said, it documents your processes. It helps you think about what should my continuity arrangements look like, and then it helps you design that BCP. So having the alignment between the two, I think, is absolutely critical. Testing, of course, is really important. We've just talked about that. It provides you assurance that your plans actually work and can be executed against. Also, as well, just ensuring that whatever the risk profile of your organization looks like, wherever you're based in the world, whatever industry you're in, it needs to ensure that it covers for the right threats and potential events that could impact your business. So be cognizant of that, be aware. And finally, I think the really important point to talk about is we sort of mentioned about the role of boards and senior management, I think, a few times. But I think accountability for business continuity does sit with a board. And whilst, of course, it's not necessarily going to be a subject that the board thinks about every day, but if a crisis happens or a major event does happen and it can't be managed, then it, of course, leads to real customer dissatisfaction, concern for investors as well as regulators as well. So being cognizant and aware of the risks that the business is facing, and how all of these different things that we've talked about today and how they're managed is really important. So I just want to say thank you for everybody for listening today. I hope that session's been useful. Many of the things we've covered are areas that we actively advise and provide assurance on with many different companies at the moment. But if anyone would like further support on any of the areas we've talked about, please contact us at the email address you can see on screen. And I think at this point, I will hand back to Jack, who I think is going to take us through some Q&A.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Mark. It was excellent. Thank you, Grace. Very, very informative presentation. Now move on to question answer session of the webinar. We have some questions from the audience, and I would like to invite everyone to please continue letting us have your questions in the chat. So our first question to both Mark and Grace, how do you prioritize critical functions during a disruption where your resources are limited?
Yeah,
Grace, do you want to take that one?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you for this question. So normally the key focus before allocating resources should be on identifying your key functions. So it might be you might need to see what is your ultimate goal. So if you're serving customers, you might need to continue serving your customers, or if you want to generate revenue or to ensure some regulatory compliance. So you need to start by identifying your essential functions that would have the most significant impact on your business if you're not performing them, and which of these are time sensitive or are more urgent than others, and then you need to allocate your resources accordingly based on the availability that you've got. And you might also need to consider if there are any interdependencies between different functions in your organization, and which teams and resources within your firm need to rely on each other to operate smoothly.
Thank you very much. How can small or medium-sized businesses implement a cost-effective BCP?
Yeah, I can certainly answer that. Thanks, Jack. I think that's a really good question. I think it's very relevant, I think, because in this region there is an enormous number of SME type businesses, and I think, as we touched on a few times today, there's limited resources always to be able to do this type of work. But I think, and I think to a certain extent, this is why we try to position today's session about kind of maybe more the implementation or the doing of some of this work, rather than just, I suppose, the theory or maybe what regulations might say in specific areas. Because I think if you're an SME, sometimes you might need to think along those lines because you've probably got limited resources yourselves. So the advice I think I would give would be, I think sometimes it's about thinking about what are the key single points of failure in your business. You know, what could be the things that could quickly escalate and turn it into a big issue. A really good example, I think, is cloud service providers. We work with lots of clients who we talk to them about business continuity, and they will readily say, great, it's in the cloud. You know, business continuity is taken care of. And of course, cloud service providers provide a fantastic service. And if you're an SME type business, clearly the resilience and support as a service you get from like an Amazon or a Microsoft is going to be much more resilient than probably what you've got if you've got a small drive stuck somewhere in your office. But of course, that doesn't mitigate risks altogether. They're just being transferred somewhere else. And when I talk about single points of failure, what I mean is I'm not talking about Microsoft or Amazon necessarily failing. I mean, of course, that's very low probability. But what's more probable is that I'm thinking along the lines of, you know, cyber attacks, where if you have a phishing attack potentially come into your firm and someone clicks on that, the single point of failure comes from the individual in your firm that clicks on that email. And if that then downloads some malware or something that then routes up into the cloud, that's going to be just as much destructive for all of your data in terms of either deleting it, altering it, destroying it, etc., than it would be for anything else. So I think for SME type firms, it's thinking along those lines and thinking about what can we do within our relatively small business to protect what we do. and ensure people at least have the knowledge and awareness to kind of act and protect what we do as a firm. And by doing that, it will cover off more of these things. Another one is kind of delegations of authority, people who have access to banking systems, which can be quite limited in smaller firms. And what happens if, God forbid, that individual suddenly is off work for a year and completely incapacitated. So, all of these types of things are good things to think about for small firms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What challenges do organizations face when integrating business continuity with their overall risk management framework?
Yes, I think I can take that. Yes, this is a question that we get frequently asked. So, I mean, the first challenge here that comes to mind is the fact that firms do sometimes often operate in silos. So when risk management and business continuity are handled separately, so this can lead to some kind of misalignments in your priorities, and it might make it a bit difficult to share information and to ensure consistent communication. So the idea here, or the lesson learned, is to break these silos and involve all the relevant departments in this exercise, not just risk or the BCP team. You need to also involve your IT, your procurement and facilities management for you to integrate business continuity and risk management frameworks together.
Thank you very much, Grace. How frequently should BCPs be tested and updated to ensure they continue to remain relevant?
Sure. Yeah, I think, well, I mean, there's no fixed answer. I mean, probably for a lot of businesses, I mean, the starting point will probably depend on whether there's any specific regulations that you're expected to comply with. I know, for example, a number of the financial services firms that we work within the free zones in the UAE will have to test their plans on an annual basis. So it's every 12 months. But as we talked about before, firms should also think about the risk profile of their organization and what feels relevant in terms of the threats to them as well. So I think from a regulatory perspective, some firms, businesses will need to want to be able to evidence that on an annual basis. But there might be a cycle or a program of testing maybe that runs over 2 years where different types of testing is done. But at least, back to what we talked about with kind of giving the board visibility into that, it at least gives them comfort. They know what's upcoming and what will be done in the future as well.
Thank you very much, Mark. That brings us to the hour. I want to say thank you very much, Mark, Grace. Thank you, everyone in the audience. It's been excellent. I've certainly learned a lot. Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, Grace. Anything to close?
No, I would just say keep safe out there. I know there is a lot happening in the world at the moment, but I think that it just shows you this subject. I know it's not the first thing, as we've said, that businesses think about every day, but it is important. And if we get it right, we help certainly live in a safer world. So, but thank you for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
And please feel free to reach out for any question or support.
Thank you.